Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for an exciting new webinar. We are going to be talking about a blueprint from increased return on investment, or ROI, in uncertain times. Very pertinent. It is quite a sign of the times where we are looking at API strategies. There's a lot of uncertainty around right now from an economic standpoint. It also obviously affects our own industry, the digital landscape, the tech industry. Things are being looked at from different perspectives. How do we try and do more with less? How do we try and maximize what we've got and get the best out of things as we move along? At the same time, there's also a lot of conversation around how do we make sure that we are building for our future vision. It may have changed, it may have stalled in some cases, but we also want to make sure that we've got the right tools, the right insights, the right processes in place so that we are set up for success in a way that helps us not just for today, but also looks towards a brighter future as we go along. So I am Budha, your product evangelist at Tyke, and I'm joined here today by James Higginbotham, who's once again one of my favorite folks. We've collaborated a lot over the years, and it's exciting to have you back with us once again. James, it's really, really good to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Wonderful. Before we dive right in, obviously there is that we can go through the agenda of what we're going to be talking about. Like I said, we're looking at a blueprint for increased ROI, hopefully with key insights and tools that you can take back after this session, and it's going to be a learning for you, hopefully a learning for us as well, and things that would enable you to create an API strategy that is a little bit more robust, a little bit more resilient to some of these uncertain circumstances. So what we thought about is, instead of going through the boring agenda for an event, instead of doing that, we'll probably think about it a little bit differently and give you a bit of a blueprint of thinking about how you look at problems and solutions. And hopefully that'll give you a bit more context of what we're going to be covering today. So with that in mind, I'm going to be moving on to the next part. So typically, when we think about a problem, and I'm giving the title what we will cover today because this is essentially our agenda slide, but typically when we think about a problem, we think about, problem and a solution together. If there is a problem, there is typically a solution associated with it. Some might disagree with it in some cases because you might feel that there is no solution to certain problems. But typically my philosophy has been that if there is no solution, it's just that we haven't stumbled upon it yet, or we haven't thought about it yet, or we haven't had the capability to create and build the solution that we think is going to solve the problem. But not going into philosophical discussions. So very, very simply, you've got a problem. You think about it as you try and solve that through a solution. Now, typically the connecting thread over there tends to be a context. Usually you want to try and think about solutions in the context of the problems that they solve, and that context matters a lot. It gives us a little bit more insight, it gives us a better understanding, and therefore helps us strategize things a little bit more. Looking at the problem side of things, there are two things that I think would enable you to think about problems differently, or maybe you're already doing this, and this is how I approach it. So as part of the problem, typically there are two things. You start off with identification. You want to identify the problem itself, and that is a key element of trying to reach or approach a solution. You want to identify what the problem is, identify ideally the source as well, that is the cause of the problem. So with that identification, it also gives you better understanding. Now, the understanding extends beyond just the identification, because you now want to have a better understanding of how that problem is impacting things. How is it impacting your day-to-day life? How it's impacting your organization? How is it impacting your users? And therefore, it'll help you make better decisions. It'll help you come up with a solution that is going to be addressing those problems for those specific contexts in mind for those specific target audiences. So with that typical sort of problem breakdown, we go into the solution side of things. And the solution, again, I look at it from two perspectives. We start off with the plan or the strategy, essentially, again, looking at from what we've identified and understood, we want to create a strategy, essentially the blueprint, so to speak, of what we are going to be doing to address that problem, how you're going to be solving it, what are going to be some of the expected outcomes and results that we want to achieve as a consequence of the solution being put in place. Solutions and planning is fine, but a key thing that is sometimes a bit of a challenge is the execution of that strategy. We talk a lot about the why behind it, but equally, I think the how-to behind it and what it's all going to be about is going to be important. So that's where the execution side of things, to enable the execution of your strategy or robust, resilient strategy, we have tools. And once again, when I think about tools, I think about it from two perspectives. And tools can be both processes as well as products or platforms. And I put emphasis on processes just as much as I would do with products and platforms, simply because processes are essentially the building blocks of what is going to enable you to take a more long-term approach to your strategic execution, because ultimately that is what keeps on going. I think you don't want to be repeating your problems. You want to have not a one-time solution, but a solution that lasts a little bit longer and approaches and builds upon itself. And I think that's where process plus, I think people, which I'm not touching upon right now because the whole other talk at another point, but people process very, very critical to solving a particular problem and executing a strategy. And then finally, we've got the platforms and products that are essentially tools that will help you achieve that strategy in different ways. And there are different tools that address different problems and provide different solutions. And we'll go over some of those in the context of what we are covering today. With that, a bit of a problem to solution journey, let's talk about what we're going to be looking to cover today as part of our agenda. So in that context, under the problem, we are going to be looking at identifying gaps in your API portfolio. And this is particularly important because you want to know what you have under your API portfolio and what is lacking right now. And once you know that, you can potentially start looking at solutions for that. Then on the understanding side of things, it's important to understand some of the common mistakes that you might be making or people in the industry and learning from them about what is some of the driving forces behind that increased cost of ownership. I think that is also important to keep in mind. When we talk about return on investment, it's not just about doing more with less, but it's also looking at how we can reduce the costs in some way or fashion. In this case, particularly, we're looking at the cost of ownership of APIs. And then when we hop on over to the solution side of things, we start off by the strategy part of it, where we're going to be looking at the consume first and build when necessary model, an approach that is essentially going to help us think about API reuse a little bit more. And again, thinking about what we can do to make sure that our overall planning is pertinent. It's contextualized to the problems that we're going to be solving. And it's a little bit more future-proof than just now in the instant, in the moment. Now, on the tool side, I haven't put anything here because I'm going to be breaking that down into two parts. And I think we're going to be looking at Eventstorming as an important area, which will help us to explore the new areas, identifying some of the API gaps and needs and reuse opportunities. We'll be looking at what this concept is. It's a very, very exciting thing. Potentially, again, a talk of its own at some point in the future, but we'll be giving you a bit of an introduction to what it all is and a bit of a small little use case and example to help you get started in thinking on those lines. And then finally, we'll be covering the API management platforms. And of course, I'm a little bit biased in this case, where I might be talking a little bit more in the context of Tyke, but API management platforms and how they lend a degree of flexibility and resilience when you're thinking about your API productization, when you're thinking about how you're packaging things, how you're integrating with other solutions, looking at products and systems and solutions that are going to be an extension of your core API infrastructure, as well as flexibility in terms of your billing and how the things need to be scaled up and down according to your needs and requirements. So that is our sort of blueprint for today's agenda and how you can think about the problem and solution. To guide us, as I said, we've already introduced James, but to guide us through this journey is going to be James Higginbotham. He's the executive API consultant for LaunchAny, and again, he's an author. He's spoken a whole lot of events. We've collaborated very recently on the API extravaganza, which comes with a whole lot of experience in this particular space. So we are glad to have you with us, and I think I'm going to kickstart today's conversation as we go along. I'm going to move out of the screen sharing mode for a little while before we jump back in, I think, for the last bit, because we want things to be a little bit more conversational as we go along. And what I like to do with these sessions is I like to set the context a little bit and start off with definitions. And there are two definitions in particular, which we touched upon during our agenda, which are going to be quite useful for people to understand a little bit more. So let's start off with that. I think, James, if you could enlighten us a little bit about what an API portfolio is. What constitutes an API portfolio in an organization? And we'll take things from there. So take it away.
Yeah, so a lot of organizations focus on delivering API products. They're trying to productize different kinds of offerings to meet the needs of different personas, market segments, different channels that they're trying to reach. But overall, a lot of organizations are producing APIs, many of which don't directly get exposed via the product. So the portfolio is the entire set of APIs that an organization owns and manages. And that might include services, it might include REST APIs, it might include GraphQL APIs, may have some gRPC. It's that whole combination of things. I sometimes even extend that a bit further because I think about asynchronous APIs, WebSocket-based APIs, server-side events, and other things, which like you've said before, there's lots of different conversations we could have in the future about those kinds of things as well. But looking holistically at the organization, what is your list of all of the APIs that you're managing today, that you have deployed and that you're using, whether it's internal or external facing? That's your API portfolio. Sometimes people refer to it as your API surface area. It's everything that you have to own and manage and take in consideration.
Great. Yep, that's a great introduction to the world of API portfolios. And I think, like you said, it's essentially taking stock of what you've got going right now from an API perspective. Now, you may think about things a little bit differently. You may think about standalone APIs and API styles, like you mentioned, could be GraphQL APIs and gRPC APIs and REST APIs, and they may be standalones. But in a lot of cases, we are seeing today that they are productized a little bit more. They're bundled together and they're not standalone as such. They're essentially coming towards identifying or sort of geared towards solving specific jobs to be done, and they enable those API products essentially enable you to do that. So your offering as an API provider is essentially what your API portfolio is all about. Typically, again, it goes a little bit beyond just the design and development of that API. It goes a little bit into the realm of having more production-ready API products where we think about the observability and your security and the versions and all of those side of things as well. So the entire package of, okay, what do you have as part of your API offering is essentially what your API portfolio is. And don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily for external consumptions alone. API portfolios can be internal to an organization as well. So you might be looking at providing APIs to power internal applications and products just as much as you might be thinking about exposing your APIs for external consumption and productizing and monetizing that for usage. So that's an introduction into the world of API portfolio. Hopefully that gives you a bit more context once we get into some of the common mistakes and gaps that we might be seeing within this API portfolio landscape. Onto the second definition, perhaps. I think the other part that we are going to be talking a little bit about is API ownership. And I think it's an interesting term because I think there are a couple of confusing aspects to this, because API ownership could be about teams and the different areas of expertise that they might bring in. That might be the API provision side of things. It might be the developer operation side of things, the actual building of the APIs. So the API ownership sometimes can be a little contentious. Okay, who is the owner of an API? Maybe it's a product manager, but it's equally important to understand this as an organization. So your take on this, James? What do you see as API ownership? What constitutes API ownership? And who is the responsible party here?
Yeah, it covers a lot of things that you're talking about in the API lifecycle. So from my perspective, a lot of what I see in organizations, the organizations that are sort of undergoing their digital transformation, or they're starting to step up and offer an API product offering, they will oftentimes start with an older approach of one team builds it, another team is supporting it. And what ends up happening then is we have this huge gap in that ownership world. That ownership goes from the identification or definition of what that API product needs to do. What problem is it solving? All the way through the design, through the development, and on to managing it, monitoring it in production. And that includes supporting it. So oftentimes what I'll see is there'll be one product manager or product owner that is ultimately responsible for that API product. But there's going to be a number of different parties that are involved in the ownership of that API. You may have support teams, developer relations teams, evangelists that are out talking to developers, starting to build, doing pre-sales engineering kind of examples and applications and things like that. And they're all working toward building up the customer base of that API product and then supporting it long term. And so when we think about the ownership, the lifecycle goes well beyond just getting it coded and pushing it out into production. And we kind of lose sight of that sometimes in some organizations, depending on what kind of background your organization's from and what kind of methodologies you're applying. But that's where we really see API ownership is it's that full spectrum of birth to eventual growth, maturity, nurturing of your customers, of your developers, and of that product. And that means you're going to go through multiple revision cycles. You're going to improve the API over time. It's not just a one and done kind of engagement. That's where we see that ownership really, really take off. And it's really important. And if we don't understand that, or if we have a different definition of it, then sometimes that can get in our way. We can lose opportunities and end up spending a lot of time and a lot of investment in APIs that we just kind of miss the mark on because we don't fully understand that full ownership life cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is, I think the reason why there might be a bit of confusion in this area is because sometimes when we think about API ownership, the immediate term that also follows that is the cost of said API ownership. And I think when we think about cost, that is a very sort of a definitive way of thinking about that ownership, because when we think about the cost of ownership, we're thinking, okay, how much does it cost to actually own that particular API as part of our portfolio? What is the infrastructural cost to it? What is the cost of the tooling that goes with it? What is the cost of the folks who are actually building and managing it? That sort of thing sort of comes into the picture. So I think that's where the API ownership conversation, I think, becomes a little less holistic, although equally important, because you need to understand these metrics, because the metrics will essentially help you make better decisions as we go along. And I think that's one of the gaps sometimes that we might be alluding to in the future. But API ownership, I think thinking a little bit more holistically is what we need. Collaborative conversations is very, very important, because otherwise we have these sort of two camps where we are thinking about the cost of the ownership of APIs, and that's where the API ownership lands. And the other side is the development of those APIs, and that's where the other side of the ownership sort of lands. So I think with that in mind, I think it'll be good to go into the next phase of things, where perhaps if you tell us a little bit about your take on the cost of ownership and how people can think about the total cost of ownership of an API or an API portfolio at large, and then think about the common mistakes that you might have seen that people are making that is essentially driving that cost of ownership up in organizations.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges a lot of organizations see is that their APIs are oftentimes led by technology leaders, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as we're bringing in the idea of product thinking with respect to that API. What's the definition of what it's doing and what it's trying to deliver, rather than getting caught up in all the details about what does the JSON structure look like, what are the HTTP methods are we using, what response codes are we using, and so on. So when we think about that product ownership aspect of everything, it really requires us to step back and think about what we're really trying to deliver. We're not just in charge of delivering code. We're in charge of delivering outcomes. So one of the biggest mistakes I see when we look at APIs and we fail to take that API product view is that we fail to align on our understanding of what the API really needs to do. And so what I do is I spend a lot of time with organizations helping them to use that as kind of a gate before they start really embarking on all of the code that has to be built, and the infrastructure and all those different pieces, is to slow down and think about, what is it that we're trying to do? What's the problem? What's the desired outcome? And then how does our API fit in the middle of that to help take someone from a problem to a solution? How do we get there? And that requires us to slow down and think about aligning on what the needs are. That might mean interviewing the developers that will be using our APIs directly, or interviewing the users that are indirectly using the API. They may not be making HTTP calls, but they're going to be consuming that API through a web, through a mobile app, a number of different channels that might be there and offered that API is backing. And so spending some time there and making sure we understand and align on that is really key. So one of the techniques that I use is you had mentioned it earlier, the idea of the jobs to be done. This really started, it was coined by Clayton Christensen. He had written a number of books about startups and building businesses. And so he was encouraging organizations, whether you're a startup or whether you're an enterprise and you're just trying to nurture and build some sort of product or value stream for your market, to look at what the job to be done is. If you can insert yourself between the problem and the desired outcome, the problem someone has, and they're saying, I wish I had this, but instead I have this problem, and you can put yourself in the middle, you can generally build a viable business or a viable product solution. And we can do the same thing with APIs. So spending some time with the align process of understanding and digging in. All of this is rooted in the voice of the customer. How do we think about what the problems are and how do we solve those problems? And I really encourage teams to use a format called job stories. They're kind of like user stories if you've seen those before. You start with the problem. So when a particular problem exists, I want to, and that's the job to be done. That's where your API will come into play and help solve that problem so that I can have a particular outcome. And if we can think about our problems that way and then design and deliver and own APIs through a long-term ownership life cycle to address that, we can grow and learn, get feedback, improve, and really grow an API product rather than just sitting down and saying, have some data over here, have a browser over here, going to build an API. That's a completely different way of thinking about things. So rather than starting at that technical problem, start thinking about the problems in the marketplace and then meet those demands. And you're going to deliver something that's going to give you a much higher return on investment. It's going to be more strategic for what your organization needs to deliver. And again, as you said before, this may not necessarily be an external facing API. It can be an internal one. You can do the same thing. What does my workforce need? What does this particular department need? What's this line of business need? And start to look at it that way. That's the number one mistake I see is people just start diving into the code. And I've got a developer background. I love writing code. It's fun, but I hate writing code that gets thrown away because it's never used. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to spend a lot of time, a lot of cycles, get big teams involved, build an API, and realize no one's really going to use it. So aligning on it is key and first and foremost in my mind.
Absolutely, 100% on that one. It's such an interesting area where I think we see something which is an exciting product. We just want to dive right in. We want to build something, we want to create something. Sometimes that's okay. I think sometimes it's fun, but I think when we are thinking about organizations and we are looking at optimizing our overall way of working, optimizing our processes, and again, I think that the key thing that comes out of these conversations and collaboration is really trying to focus and prioritize. Because ultimately, time is a limited resource. You really still can't make new, you can't expand time, you can't extend time. You can, time is going to flow the way it does. You will have X amount of hours in a day that you can work, and you can focus on only so many things within those hours. And within that period of time, you need to focus and prioritize the things that is going to drive the maximum value, potentially mixed with what is going to be driving you yourself as well, so that it's not all mundane and boring in your opinion, but essentially a good combination of both, where you can think about the priority of what the organization needs and what you need. And hopefully there is going to be a merging of that, a sort of intersection of that. And that is only going to happen once you collaborate and communicate, what your thoughts or opinions are on things, and understanding why certain things are more important than the others and why certain things can wait. And I think that is very important, especially when things are going uncertain. When there is uncertainty, I think the way to dispel some of that uncertainty is to have open conversations, open communication, and shared understanding of what's going on in the industry, what is going on in terms of our users. One common mistake that I definitely see sometimes is, I think you touched upon this a little bit about the internal and external. I think sometimes we miss the boat a little bit about thinking about our own internal users and the importance of understanding how they operate on a day-to-day basis. And this is sort of the crux of what platform engineering is sort of geared up to be, a little bit of an extension of what developer operations is already looking into. But just thinking about the internal developer platforms and internal platforms that are essentially making things more collaborative, making things more possible, making things a little bit more resilient and easy to use internally, so that it boosts productivity externally. I think that is very, very important, just as important perhaps in as compared to building out products that are external facing. Because if you can put a little bit more, invest a little bit more time to build out those tools internally, it's going to save you so much more time and effort as you move along. And again, it comes down to priority. Sometimes you are, if you're really early stage, you may not have the time or the ability to do some of that investment upfront, but at a specific scale, I think it is worth looking into it. A second common thing, I think you obviously spoke about collaboration So when I say second, I think we're now on the third common mistake that I've seen is also over planning sometimes. And I think when it comes to API products or building out solutions, a lot of times people tend to think about an ideal state or a perfect state in which we are going to be launching a product. And I think that's sort of led to the understanding of a minimum viable product. But again, that can be a little bit fuzzy for people. For one person's minimum viable product might be a lot further ahead than some of the others. And the mistake that is associated with it is also thinking and looking at what your competitors and the industry leaders are also doing, and sort of trying to map your version 1 to maybe a version 42 or 50 of your competitor's product that has already been in the market out there. You probably don't need that right now. And I think in most cases, you need to think and start small. Obviously, don't build a bad product, I think, but build a product that solve maybe one problem, maybe two problems, and get it out there, test it out, get more feedback. I think if you don't do that, you are working in silos, and you may have gone you can sprint in two possible directions. One is in the direction that is going to give you the maximum gain, but you can equally go in the opposite direction, and you're going further ahead from your goal and outcome. So this is essentially a way to test that and trying to course correct a lot earlier compared to going back and forth and thinking within your team that, okay, this is right or that is right. And by the time it's out, it might just be a little bit too late. So that's sort of the other thing that I look at, the over planning aspect of when you consider yourself ready versus when you're actually ready for your API product to be tested and used.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I see a lot of organizations, they get very excited about their API program, particularly enterprise IT. They get excited and like, okay, we need to map out that target state, and there is some value in spending some time and understanding kind of the rough taxonomy or structure to your portfolio. How are we going to group things together based on what we know today? Are we going to group based on business units or domain areas, or functional areas of value streams, and kind of figuring out what makes sense for your organization, and having a sketch and kind of knowing, but being able to make adjustments. So that's one aspect of that over planning that I see a lot in the enterprise side, is they feel like they have to know it all, and they need to know what every API in their portfolio is going to be, so that, and then they're going to just design and deliver to that roadmap, and they miss opportunities to stop, listen, ask questions, and gain feedback. So they take this more waterfall approach to their API program. And to your point, an MVP might be, well, let's find one value stream and start delivering the APIs for that. And let's be minimal on our design, and let's learn, and let's ask questions and listen before we start writing code, or before we start leveraging what we already have. Maybe we have some work that we've already done that we can leverage. Hey, that's great. But rather than being myopic to saying, well, this is what we've done, so this is what we're going to need to do, or what we're going to make our API look like, ask some questions and make sure you understand it fully, engage, listen. Just outside the API space, I've been dealing with a number of vendors on a remodel project for a home, and I can tell you that the good contractors stop, listen, take notes. They remember things, they apply context, they inject their opinion where it makes sense, and they listen to the homeowner, ultimately, to do what they need to do, and they show up. They show up, they listen, they ask questions. That separates a great vendor that's helping you to remodel your home or whatever it is, from someone who falls short. They're not communicating, they're not listening, they're just doing kind of in a pre-programmed systematic state whatever they know what to do. Likewise, in our API programs, we stop, we listen, we get feedback, we incorporate, we iterate, we have opportunities to sometimes catch up to that competitor that has version 42 of the API, but they've stopped doing that. And the needs have changed in the marketplace, and you can jump in and come in, or you can add value and be complementary to what they offer, because you're starting to listen and see where the gaps are, and you can start to address those gaps. So that's a huge way to come in and really benefit in a time of uncertainty, is fill in those gaps of where people aren't having their needs met.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just as an addendum to that as well, I think it's important to sort of make a distinction between listening to feedback, taking that back, and building your own solution based off of it, versus just giving people what they've been asking for. Because they're two very different things. Because ultimately, I'm still of the camp where I'm not entirely convinced that people know exactly what they want every time. They have a problem, and I think if you're listening carefully, you will probably be able to get to the root of that problem and solve that, as opposed to someone just saying or stating things anecdotally that they need this, they want this, and therefore you're going by those whims and fancies. So there's a little bit of difference there. I think there is that difference between listening to feedback and taking that back versus just giving people what they want. So there's a little bit of distinction. Thought I'll add that. But moving on from the problem side of things, obviously, I think it's important to sort of start thinking, formulating a solution, and how people can start looking at that. One of the areas I think that you initially, when we were discussing about, you spoke about this a little bit, where you talked a little bit about consume first and build when necessary approach. Tell us a little bit more about that. What's your take on it?
So a lot of organizations I work with, they spend a considerable amount of time making sure that they have their style guides in place. So if I'm building an API, if I'm designing an API, it's going to be consistent. There's room for using different patterns, different approaches, but there's a bit of consistency in it, so that me as the consuming developer, when I use one API, then when I go to the next API in your portfolio, I should have a similar experience. The error handling, I should be able to re-leverage again. I've gained some knowledge, and now I should be able to accelerate the path to consuming the second, third, fifth, 10th API from you. But what I don't see a lot of organizations doing is encouraging a first level of consumption, or a consume first model. So they've designed all these APIs. They have a portfolio. I have clients that have portfolios of thousands of APIs, but most of those APIs are long tail APIs that have one or two consumers to them. They have not really taught their developers to slow down and go look at the catalog first, look at the portfolio of APIs that we have, and try to leverage something that already exists. They immediately assume, either because they're not used to or not thinking about the fact that months, years have gone by. We have this big portfolio of APIs now. Let's use those first. Or we've abandoned the idea of product ownership, the API ownership aspect of things. So the APIs aren't being improved. If I find an API that I like, but it's missing a couple of fields, I know that those fields exist in our backend systems, but I can't exactly get to them from your API. Is there someone to contact so that I could say, hey, do you think you could add those extra couple of fields? What do you think? Is this a big deal? Is it not? Is it something you can get into your work stream? Is this something you can deliver in a timely fashion? So what we end up having is teams constantly build APIs instead of reusing and consuming what already exists. So there's this idea here of, the executives want to hear reuse. They want to have a portfolio of APIs that have multiple consumers for each one, or we have products that we've been able to sell and resell and use economies of scale to be able to sell to different markets and different channels, benefit from. The problem is that because we're so focused on building, we forget to consume. And so that methodology or mentality of shifting an organization from build first to consume first takes concerted effort, but does pay off a lot and allows you to get to that goal of reuse that a lot of executives want to see, but sometimes don't always come to fruition. They struggle with that.
100%. I think that's been some of a bit of a crux within Tyke as well. I think when we built our API gateway and the APIs that are going to be exposed externally, we built it in a way that we ourselves are using our own product, and I think it gives us more insights into this. And interesting enough, I had a conversation with I think one of the founders or executives at Stack Overflow during the developer week last week. And he mentioned the same thing. It's essentially the entire knowledge base of their organization is using Stack Overflow to document everything, asking questions, getting feedback, all of that. So they know what are some of the challenges that their users are going to be facing, because they treat themselves, their own team members, as users. And once you start looking through the workflows, looking at what is going right, what is going wrong, and where you can improve, I think that makes such a big difference, because you're not just listening, you've actually experienced it now, and you can take that forward. Your experiences, both positive and negative, would be a critical sort of data point in making that decision. Okay, what do you prioritize next as a feature, as a component, as the next step and the next journey of your API strategy? Interesting enough, I think the key challenge sometimes is, obviously this is one aspect of it. The other part is also the process. How do you think about putting in a process that would enable and encourage more use of the product, but also looking at feedback, and you just stop to look at what you've already built, as opposed to just taking new tickets and new features. Look at what has already come before and what can we optimize and enhance, as opposed to build new. It's not just limited to APIs, interesting enough, because I think we see the same with content. I think there's just more and more and more and more content coming in. I think we sometimes take a step back and say, okay, what can we reuse, repurpose, maybe change that a little bit more and update it. There was actually a conversation internally as well when we were thinking about product engineering, where should we take a bit of a time off? And I think we do this regularly to look at, what we have delivered so far. How can we actually optimize that further? If there are issues and bugs that, there may not be high priority, but it's going to make things a little bit more cleaner. So how do you see organizations potentially approaching? I think one of the examples that you gave was obviously using users or treating users, internal users, as consumers. But what about the process? How do we enhance the process as part of the overall strategy within organizations to make this possible?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways you can do it. One of the ways that I've found that's really beneficial, just something tactical that anybody can do that has APIs today, is start with their documentation. Go back and look at their documentation and understand what is the documentation saying and what kind of opportunities do we have to improve it. And in the process of writing documentation, like a getting started guide, let's say that several of our customers are using it for the same type of use case, but we don't have a getting started guide for it. Put something like that together and say, let's do let's do some documentation improvement. Let's see what does it look like, and let's experience that pain ourselves and understand how people are using our APIs ourselves. So that's one idea there. The documentation that you have for your API can actually be a salesperson. It can be a virtual salesperson that's always on 24/7, helping people to understand what you can do with your API. And from that perspective, spending some time in documentation will benefit both your sales cycle, but also can benefit that product ownership side of just getting fresh eyes on things. How are people using it, and things like that. The other is using techniques like we're going to be talking about Eventstorming, using things like Eventstorming to kind of lay out and verify, are people still using the same processes that they've used before? Are they still experiencing the same problems? Or is there new problems now that we need to explore, and to be able to map that out and find new opportunities to make sure that we're still delivering something that's relevant to our consumers. Keeping in mind that our APIs, if people are integrating with your APIs, particularly a product, if you have a partner or a customer, the cost of change is very high. The cost of change is very high to be able to undo and redo that integration. And so what that means then is you have an opportunity to keep your customer churn low, to reduce the customer churn of your product by leveraging APIs to keep your customers happy. By doing that, you're giving them more of an incentive to stay with you and not to jump ship to a competitor. So that way, you put all those things together and you're looking at your customer base, you're trying to remain relevant, you're understanding how people are using your API, you're upgrading your documentation, you're making the documentation work for you as a salesperson out there, helping people to understand what they can do with that API, what new features have you added that they can further integrate and further be connected in with you and be partnered with you, so that you can continue to keep that customer churn low as you're moving forward. So those are some things that I see oftentimes, and you can use that whether you're in enterprise IT or whether you are software as a service. Either one of those sides, you can leverage these kinds of things to take advantage of it, and then use Eventstorming to kind of fill in and reevaluate kind of the bigger picture ideas.
100%. I mean, I tend to agree with everything you say. I think I've realized I'm trying to catch myself not to say 100% agree with everything that you're saying. But anyway, the key thing there, you're absolutely right again, where we've had this discussion with our commercial teams as well. It's always easier to keep our existing customers happy and sort of build on that relationship and their requirements and sort of expand from there, as opposed to trying and acquire new customers and sort of go through that entire process straight away. So if there is an opportunity for you to look back and think about how you can reduce churn, I think that's probably going to be hugely more beneficial compared to trying and focusing a huge amount of energy and effort in acquiring new ones. And again, there's a balance to that. But at the same time, I think if you are keeping your existing customers happy, there's an opportunity there that they would become, hopefully, advocates for what you are building and creating. And that would, again, amplify your voice, amplify your brand, amplify your identity, and hopefully other people will be listening in the industry from a slightly more neutral party compared to, your own sales commercial and evangelists talking about it. So, just a couple of things to keep in mind there. But you've mentioned a couple of times about event storming. I know we are getting close to the end of time, so I definitely want to go dive deeper into the world of event storming. Perhaps kick us off a little bit, James. Tell us a little bit more about what event storming is. And I think once you are ready, I'll help you flash the screen with the example that we can go through after. So tell us a little bit more about event storming, what it is and why it is important, what problem it's solving.
Yeah, in brief, Eventstorming was created by Alberto Brandolini. He used a lot of other diagramming and collaborative methodologies to come up with this. He actually has a book out that talks a bit about how to conduct Eventstorming sessions. In short, it's a collaborative way for business, product, and technology to all come together and to understand a particular problem space, and you map it out by understanding a bit more about the domain events and other things. If you could bring up that diagram, what you do is you collaboratively work together. Oftentimes it's done in person. And so in person, a lot of what happens is we'll have, say, a big conference room, or I've even conducted sessions in hotel conference rooms because they usually have really big conference rooms, sometimes compared to office buildings, where we can have a big wall or multiple walls and these sticky notes, and they're each have different colors, and those colors mean different things. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all the details, but what we can do is we can start to map out processes. We can do big idea event storming and start to understand how does everything flow through. So this is an example of an e-commerce website. It's like a bookstore, and you start off by looking at what are the things that we want to do: add books to carts, remove books from a cart, and so on. We typically start with the orange stickies, the events. So a book was added to a cart, a book was removed from a cart. Then we can add and embellish with different colored sticky notes to understand more about the domain. So you can bring in your subject matter experts, you bring in your tech leads, you bring in your business, and you understand the particular solution area that you're trying to look at. What's really valuable about this is it allows us to align, like we talked about before, having that problem of not aligning properly. One of the things that we do as developers is that we're building in assumptions into every line of code that we write. And so we're making decisions about how things are going to work, whether that they actually reflect reality or desired state or not. So instead, let's sit down and spend a little time collaborating. And it may take just a few hours, or it might take a few hours spread across a few days to get those sessions worked out. But if we bring everybody together and lay these things out, it allows us to understand value streams and supply chains and how all these things come together. And then we can start looking to see, well, what APIs do we have that already solve these problems? This is our consume first. So do we have something already that allows us to do these things? Then if not, then we can identify different areas of bounded areas where our APIs might need to be built. But we can consume first, and then we can identify APIs that need to be built. And we start to see what operations they need to have: add a book to a cart, remove a book from a cart, so on. Those are the types of things that we need. So when we use things like event storming, we can do a few things. We can look for gaps in our portfolio and fill them in, because we can start mapping out what the workflow is. And if we started from code, started from the tech side, and started building services and different APIs and so on, we may not actually know what we have and what we're missing. And so we can use event storming to understand what's actually happening in reality, or what needs to happen in our target state. And then to match our existing portfolio assets, our different APIs, event streams, and so on, to find out what we have, what we need. And then we can start to fill in those gaps. And then we start to add more and more value. We can also use event storming to gather up and understand our user interviews. So as you said, we need to ask questions, we need to get feedback. Well, let's take that feedback in and not just say, okay, well, let's spin up a feature to solve that problem because someone said that's what they wanted. Let's look at the bigger picture. Let's understand how what they're talking about fits in. Is there a way we can look at it in a different way to solve the same problem, to deliver what they're doing, or maybe deliver more, or even something even better than what they were actually asking for, because we've mapped it out. So event storming is a great way to get started, to find where your APIs exist, to find what operations your APIs are going to need. And you can do that in combination with job stories to understand what the desired outcomes are and what those steps are to get there, by breaking those things down and mapping those out. And as I said, it's a collaborative effort. It involves everyone. Key representatives from business, tech, and product to be able to understand and contribute to this, and then understand what we need to deliver on. So this is a great way to really focus your efforts, make sure you're delivering value, make sure you're not starting from the bottom up and writing a bunch of code and building a bunch of services, but then you look and you go, well, none of these services actually solve problems. They just move data around and they're kind of necessary, but we kind of missed the mark a little bit. Let's go back and let's use event storming. So prefer to use it up front, but sometimes we might go back and use that to reverse engineer something we already have, find out what APIs already exist, and then fill in the gaps and make a huge difference in expanding out our portfolio, and therefore then getting more, even closer and closer to that consume first mentality, because now we're starting to find what that value stream is, and we're laying out all the activities and we're delivering APIs to meet that.
Understood. I have a couple of questions out of this. So because I'm very curious about this, I think it makes a whole lot of sense. Again, it brings that collaborative nature into the process of thinking about new capabilities, not just features, but actual capabilities that we are adding and the value that is driven by it. I'm curious, how do you think about the success of an event storming event storming session, for instance? What is the definition of success in this case? Is it at the end of this? I'm assuming it's probably not right at the end of the session. Maybe there is a definition of success at that point where you come to a consensus with a group of people. But equally, how do you measure for whether this is working or not working, and then potentially whether you have to revisit and have another event storming session in the future?
Mm-hmm. So you can use event storming at different levels of granularity too. So we might do big idea event storming, and then as we're moving forward, we might need to dig in and get more details. So we might have separate event storming sessions to really dig in even further. But really, for me, success is making sure that everybody's aligned and all the requirements are surfaced. That we've answered questions, that we've broken down assumptions, that we're not going in going, well, I'm just assuming that these particular things are needed, or this is the way it's supposed to work. And so if we have questions, we use these little hot pink stickies, that like this one here that has the little question mark stripe. We're talking about here, we need to submit payment details. Well, are we going to use our own payment processor and payment gateway? Or are we going to use a third party? What are we going to do here? So one definition of success is shared understanding and breaking down assumptions. That's huge, because now we're all aligned and understand what we need to be able to deliver. Another thing is shared domain vocabulary. So from the idea of when we're going through this, we don't use different terms. You might use the term item, I might use book. Which one? We need to come to a resolution of that. Otherwise, our APIs are going to be all over the place. Our resource names are going to be all over the place. It's not going to make sense. When our third-party consumers come in, we open this up to partners and customers, and they want to use it. Are they going to understand it? Have we created shared understanding not only between ourselves, but between ourselves and the consumer? We surfaced up unknowns. And then likewise, we've looked at these value streams and we've identified where are the high value APIs. Which APIs might we use third party, just like the idea with Stripe, or any number of other third party APIs we might use for an e-commerce website. Which ones are most beneficial for us to build ourselves, high value, proprietary? Maybe we have some of our own business intelligence, machine learning, whatever it is. Okay, well, we're going to use that, or we're going to leverage these other third-party APIs. So there's a lot of value that comes out of event storming. And so making sure that we've addressed all of these questions, we've broken down all the assumptions, we have shared understanding, we've identified where these different areas are. We can then use that to kind of size up what APIs do we need, what's the MVP for this area, what's the minimum viable. Maybe we take some of these stickies and say, we're going to make these priority 2. We'll do this on the next release. What are our primary MVP operations we need for our API to support what our ultimate product or automation integration offering is? What is it that we need? And so this allows us to really come away with that clear understanding.
Yeah, I think for me, I think that's a very important thing. I think the definition of success with something like this could obviously there is the plan and the proposition that goes with it, For me, the important part is, okay, what have we put on paper? And I'm talking about paper metaphorically here, but essentially, okay, what are the next steps? Have we documented the outcomes and the activities that are going to come out of this event storming session? For different teams that are involved over here, how does this affect the commercial teams? How does it affect the marketing team? How does the product team, engineering teams look at this? Is it listed somewhere potentially? I think then that could be a few different tools that enable you to do that. Could be your Confluence or Monday or Jira, wherever you document it. But there needs to be that documentation to sort of solidify the conversation, because that oftentimes, I think, to me, we use a whole lot of tools. I think there is Miro that we use for a lot of these sort of virtual sticky notes and event storming, brainstorming sessions in a lot of different ways. And to me, that is great. I think that brings people together. It builds that shared understanding. But I think for me, it's also about what comes next, because I don't want that to be a one and done. I want that to be actioned upon. I want that to be followed up on. I want to track what is happening right, what is going wrong, how far ahead we are. And that will only happen once we've put the right process in place. We've listed that down somewhere. It took me a little bit while to get to that point with some of the stuff and listing everything and all those activities. It feels like a little bit of extra work to be done, but I think that goes a long way to tell us that we are not just thinking anecdotally. Once again, we are not just talking within ourselves, but we're also tracking things, monitoring things, and actually creating the right solutions as we go along. So with that, great introduction to event storming. Hopefully we'll be able to explore this in the future in a greater detail, perhaps a workshop at some point. But for now, I think that's a great introduction of what event storming is, how the importance of it, and how you can potentially adopt that inside your organization. And if you've obviously got questions at any point of time, do feel free to reach out to us. And perhaps James will be able to help out with some of that. I'll be able to help out with some of that, and we'll take that conversation forward with it for your organization. The final part that I want to cover today, and I think we've got barely about 5 minutes left. So the final part that I wanted to talk about is, again, a tool that is quite specific and important for this particular landscape. And I think we've been talking about APIs, we've been talking about API strategy, talking a little bit more about flexibility. And I think that's where something like an API management platform comes in. And like I said, I'm a little biased because I've been working with Tyke for almost 3 years now, and I'm an evangelist after all. But in general as well, I would say probably an API management platform as part of your API stack is a critical component, regardless of what you are building, or maybe unless you're really, really, really just about getting started, it is something that is going to bring a whole lot of value. At the very least, it adds a layer of security, it adds a layer of resilience to your overall API product stack, which in itself is hugely beneficial. You're not looking to actually build out a lot of that logic and combine that with your business logic at your microservices level. You're essentially abstracting all of that out a level higher, which again makes it a lot easier to standardize things, to make governance practices and rules and policies, as boring as they might sound. It makes it a lot more easy for you to adopt and apply that across organizations without having to think too much about it. Because once those rules are set, it's essentially, as long as your microservice falls within that umbrella of the API product stack, I think it is those rules and policies will get applied, and that's going to be the foundation for any kind of innovation that you might be looking at. You need standardization to innovate. I'm a big proponent of that, and again, we see this over and over again. We've seen simplification of some of this through developer operations and DevOps teams coming in and building those guardrails. And I think platform engineering conversations are going in a similar direction, where we are looking at that golden path for developers, where you are enabled and encouraged and empowered to do the things that really, really matters to you, building out those products, building out those capabilities, taking feedback and enhancing things, as opposed to getting bogged down by the more infrastructural things, the administrative side of things, which again don't really energize you enough to come to work. What is going to be the thing that is going to get you to work? Are you going to be happy to come to work on a Monday, or are you going to be, looking forward to it, or are you going to be taking a leave perhaps? But no, maybe not. So that's one of the aspect of things. I think just that flexibility and resilience that is built in, the guardrails that comes with the API management platforms, it's a big deal. But the other aspect of things is also flexibility. I think we spoke about, in an uncertain economy, it's important to have flexibility, and flexibility goes in a few different ways. One type of flexibility is just using the right tools for the right job. And now the importance of that is obviously you don't want to be tied into specific ecosystems, because maybe your needs today may not stay the same tomorrow. And what you want to avoid to a certain extent is that you don't want to have to move every single thing and the entire API stack that you've built over a year or so, or maybe more, over to an entirely new platform, because your needs have completely changed and your old platform and system is no longer capable of meeting those needs. So in order to do that, you need something that is potentially a little bit more vendor agnostic. You need something that plays well within a multi-cloud environment. You probably need something that brings that level of flexibility, that brings a lot of value out of the box, but equally gives you the ability to extend the capabilities as you need, as the changes happen. And the extension could be through plugins. The extension could be through integrating with other solutions and tools that are out there in the market. And I think that's, again, if we go back to one of the challenges that we spoke about, the common mistakes, it is that over planning. And sometimes over planning happens because you're too unsure about the future and you're trying to plan for every possible permutation and combination. When you try to do that, you're trying to over prepare and over plan. And I think that's where having a solution that is flexible in nature brings that added peace of mind that is going to really, really propel your API strategy for the future. The other aspect of this is also billing. As your needs scale up or scale down, you should be able to have flexible billing options. And I think typically with the more self-managed and on-premise side of things, this can be maybe challenging at times, but if you're going with a SaaS solution, in most cases, you should have that billing flexibility built in. You should be able to monitor, map what's going on, and make decisions depending on how your needs are evolving. And you should not, once again, be tied into a decision for a long term, especially when things are not certain and clear enough. So as you learn, as you try, as you test, and as you iterate, you should have a solution that is as flexible and dynamic in nature to address and meet those needs and requirements of yours. That's kind of my 2 cents on this about how an API management platform comes in. I believe, James, you've got your own insights into this world around API products too. So go ahead.
Yeah. So a lot of what I've seen, you mentioned a lot of really good things and a lot of really important things from the infrastructure platform engineering side, but sometimes people don't realize that the API management layer is also a tool in the tool belt of the product owner, or of the SaaS product management team, the directors of product, or chief product officers. Um, API management layers give you the ability, the flexibility to be able to bundle new products. So if you have a number of services or a number of APIs behind your API management layer, you can leverage those and organize or bundle those services into new offerings. So as you're learning and hearing things from the marketplace, let's say we have an opportunity for a partnership with someone. There's a need now for people to leverage some of what we do, but they don't need all the APIs that we typically offer. We could create a new product bundle specifically tailored to that type of partner. And then now we have this new channel. We can start selling to other people that want that same kind of partnership with us, just by simply leveraging the existing capabilities of the API management layer and its routing and everything else to bundle and then attach billing and attach the reporting and metrics and monitoring and everything else already there. We're already doing it once. Now we can spin up a new product and do that again. So we get to leverage and get reuse at a global scale rather than reuse at a local scale. Instead of just reusing a service internally for some other need, we're now rebundling things together and just creating like a new endpoint, maybe another path or something, and we can have our own set of scopes and responsibilities and rules, all using that same API management layer, and all, as you said, kind of agnostic to the vendors that we're using behind the scenes. So as we have to move things around, we have that ability too. So we have that flexibility at the infrastructure level, and we have the flexibility at the product offering level as well. So there's a lot of value by having that API management layer instead of having it baked into your code for your services, having it separate, having it as a middleware proxy that's a tool that's driving your platform. It's driving a lot of your infrastructure. It's driving your monitoring, your billing, all your management, all of that API ownership that we talked about at the very beginning.
Yes, and I think just adding on to that agnosticism and flexibility, I think the other side of that part is also just the support for open API standards. I think that's a critical component here as well, because when we think about integration and working with other tools, I think we spoke about speaking the common language earlier on for collaboration. I think this is the same thing when it goes to tools as well. Tools speaking the same open standard conversation language that essentially enables that integration being made possible, playing well with different tools that again speak the same language. So that could go to your open API specification for your API definitions and like what's consuming that the entire API lifecycle under there, extending that further through open telemetry potentially, and thinking about how you're looking and adding in better insights into what your API and how your API is being what's going on with your API infrastructure essentially, and what's happening within your portfolio a little bit more. And again, connecting with other solutions and systems that would enhance the things that are built for purpose beyond what you as your core business are offering at this point of time. So all of those different things really powered by those open standards. So if you've got an option, a chance to consider an open source solution or a solution that really supports open API standards, I think that'll be another great way to think about maximizing your ROI, not just today, but in the future as well. Because in all likelihood, the proprietary stuff may go away, but open standards that are backed by a whole lot of organizations, a whole lot of developers, I think that they are here to stay. And I think that is going to be the future that is going to be shaped as we move along. I think there's going to be, we'll be seeing more and more of open API standards coming in all possible realms of existence as we go within the digital landscape, and we'll see more such things coming up, and tools that are going to be supporting them will be at the forefront of things. Otherwise, you might just be left behind a little bit more. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you so much. We are at time, a little bit over time. I don't see any questions. If you do have any questions, do feel free to add that to the Q&A segment. We may not have enough time for that today, but having said that, this has been an incredible conversation so far. I think we've touched upon so many different things, right from the problem identification and understanding all the way down to the solution, the strategy, the approach that you can take, as well as some of the tools, the processes, the platforms that will help you execute the strategy that is going to make for a more robust, future-proof API strategy, enabling better ROI, hopefully boosting that the engineering efficiency side of things as well a little bit more through all of these conversations, and creating something that that would help your organization do better and your users do better at the same time. So hopefully you got some great takeaways from here. Tell us how you felt about it. Do reach out to us. We are open for feedback. We will be listening, as we said, and hopefully we'll be looking to produce even better conversations in the future. This already was fantastic. I learned a lot myself. Thank you so much, James, for joining us today and sharing all of those amazing insights into the world of API strategy.
Yeah, thank you as well. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot as well from you. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. And until next time, have a good day. Bye-bye.